His name is Vanderbilt, and
I'm sorry, Vander?
his name is Lucian. I got a Vander Volgen.
Oh,
And he was born in 1689, and he was about 12 years old, coming on to 11 to 12 years old at the time of the Schenectady massacre. And he was taken prisoner. He was one of the 26 people who were taken prisoner. And he was one of the last prisoners to be repatriated. And he was adopted into a tribe of the Canadian or the Catholic Mohawks, who had actually been part of the raiding party. And this is some of his story. He went on after his return home to do a lot of interesting inter-Indian, Dutch, English communication, translation. But Lucian, the young Mohawk warrior, stood at the end of the trail where it entered the river and looked across at the village. It was his village, or was it? It was where he was born, and that winter cold night and day when he was taken away from his sister and his mother. He had wanted to come back, but he wasn't sure that he was the same person. He knew who he was. He stood in his leggings and his loincloth. He stood with his warlock on end, but not painted or gathered for war. And the buckskin vest just lightly covered his shoulders. He was 18 years old, confident but afraid of going home. He wasn't sure where home was. There was no ford of the river, so he and his 3 traveling companions, one of whom he called brother because they were raised in the same family, up in Kanagawa. Kanagawa was the home that he had been taken to after the raid, after the long, grueling hike on snowshoes through the trees, carrying a big pack. It was a struggle for an 11-year-old boy, but he remembers even then that his Mohawk father had helped him through the cold and through the deep snow. And even though he was hurt and crying inside, he put on a brave face and knew that there was rapport between this savage and himself, the savage that he came to call father. His Indian name that was given to him 2 years after he came to the St. Lawrence Valley meant he who does not bend easily. And that was the way he was known. And it was his strength and resilience that had let them go and travel back to the valley that he had been born in. So he had brought his brother and 2 friends to visit once again and determine who in his family was there. Perhaps his mother, perhaps his little sister. And so they traveled by canoe simply across the Mohawk through its rush and came to the trail that led not so much to the stockade that hadn't been rebuilt, but there was a blockhouse and there were soldiers and they were on guard, even for Mohawks, because one never knew whether the Mohawk was a Canadian Mohawk in French or a Dutch Mohawk and friendly. They gave the peace sign as they got out of the canoes and walked to the gate. And at the gate, he asked if there were any of his family. They looked at them. And one man who looked to be a Veeder said, "Well, you're Lucian Vandlar." And he said, "Yes." He spoke in French, but he said, oui. And they were scurrying and going around, and they led him by the hand down the street. There was still only one street in town, and they brought him to a relatively new house. And the word had gone forward, and out of the door came his mother. He wasn't ready. He had been prepared to be in the village, but he did not expect his mother. You see, the last time he saw his mother, it was across a snow-packed bit of earth. The French and Indians had just set the fire to the church. And in that church, Johann Glenn had selected his mother and his sister from among the potential captives and said they were his cousins, so they did not get carried away. And here they were in the village again. Oh, it was remarkable. And there was hugging, and there was crying, and there was dancing. He slept in the lodge of his mother and sister. He didn't know where else to sleep, and they allowed his 3 companions, his brother and his 2 companions, to sleep in the house as well. And for several days there was comfort and reacquaintance and the beginning of some English talk rather than French talk or Mohawk talk. Lucien began to feel somewhat comfortable, but his mind raced back to the young Indian maiden that he knew he loved in the North Country. And here he was in this place that was now foreign. So at breakfast that 5th day, he said to his mother and his sister that he was going to return the next morning to Canada. There was longing, there was understanding, there was a big final gathering which involved a lot of food and some really neat, good small beer. And he fell asleep, not in his bunk, but around the fire in the living room. About 2 o'clock in the morning, his sister got up, and she had decided that she wanted Lucien to stay. And she did a very interesting thing. She shaved his head. She cut off the sign of Mohawk manhood. And he was so sleepy that he didn't wake up. And when he woke in the morning, he was bald. There was not even a little scruff at the back that would show that he ever had a warlock. He was angry, he was fit to be tied. His friends were confused and angry. They had been tricked, he had been tricked, and his sister was nowhere to be found until about lunchtime. And since they hadn't gone, she came home. And he was about to beat her. And she looked him in the eye. She said, "Lucien, I'm your sister. I know you have another life, but you have another life here if you choose to. And I know you could not go home to the Mohawk villages until your hair grows back. And if at the time your warlock is returned, you still want to go to Canada, we will all bless you on your way." Took a long walk, several days' walk up the valley. By the time he returned, his hair had grown in enough to be visible. But in 2 months, when his hair was enough that he could have shaved it like an Indian and begun to show the warlock and leave for Canada, because by the time he arrived back in his Canadian home, his warlock would be long enough to braid feathers and trinkets and paint for war. But he decided to stay in Schenectady. He continued to be able to speak French and English and Dutch, and to be an able intermediary between the white French and the Indian people. And he accomplished this over the next 50 years. He was an old man living in the western longhouse of the Seneca when he passed away, but it was by his choice, and he made it very late in his life because of the ability to travel back and forth between the red man's world and the white man's world. So that's all behind the portrait of Lucien Vogelaar that hangs in the Historical Society.